let's go to some questions. It's been such fun actually being in the middle of this conversation, but we've had a lot of questions texted in, so we really must get to a few of them. I think this is a really interesting one. What new evidence would be sufficient to lead the speakers to adopt the opposite view? So if I perhaps ask that first of you, Peter, is there any kind of evidence that John could bring to bear that would actually make you change your mind and think actually maybe there is a God?
I think that's very interesting. I have asked myself that question previously. Is there any evidence that would flip me into the belief camp? And so I simply can't think of any. I think if I tell myself that if I agreed with some evidence, then it showed that I'd simply gone mad.
Right.
So it's a serious question, but I don't think there can be any evidence.
Are you saying your position is unfalsifiable in that sense?
Yes, because even if I was standing, at the foot of a cross and saw the resurrection before my very eyes, I would put it down to hallucination. It's an extension of the David Hume argument.
Do you want to make a comment firstly on the fact that for Peter there's literally nothing that could convince him that God exists?
I'm very interested in what he said at the end, that he would believe it was a hallucination. And he mentioned to me before that the psychologists would work on what I say, but they'd work on what he said. And one of the evidences for the resurrection of Jesus actually is the work psychologists have done in pointing out that it could not have been a hallucination. He was seen by over 500 people at once, different times of day or night, and all this kind of thing. But there are things that would reverse me.
Okay, tell us what they are.
I joined Peter. If you could give me evidence that the gospel writers, for example, like Luke, were not authentic, if you could give me evidence that there's a really convincing explanation that Jesus did not rise from the dead, if you could show me that all the experiences I've had in life with my family and with other people that I would definitively put down to the activity of God, then I'd be prepared to consider. But those cumulative evidences in my life are so large that I don't think it's likely to happen. But I have to be open to that. Why? Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, because I come from a very religious country, I was accused, and I've been accused tonight of the same thing, of course you believe that stuff, you're Irish, is the old Freudian explanation. So what have I done? I spent my entire life opening up my Christian commitment to its opposite. It's exactly what I'm doing tonight. And I've spent my life doing it. A lot of it in Russia, incidentally, where you meet really hard atheism. And doing that, constantly questioning my own position, has confirmed my position. Now, Peter, do you constantly question your own position? Or do you see no reason to do that?
I see no reason to do that.
Yes, well, I see great reason to do it because I don't want to be fooled.
But I see in you an example of the power of cultural conditioning that takes place during childhood.
Well, Peter, I could argue the same. You see, the Freudian argument that says the religion is wish fulfillment, it works brilliantly if there is no God. But you see, I would want to argue that if there is a God, Peter's atheism can equally well be explained as wish fulfillment, the desire never to have to encounter God. The Freudian argument doesn't deal with the basic question, is there a God or not? So I simply think that...
But you see, I want to understand the workings of the world on this side of the grave.
So do I.
You seem to want to understand them on the other side.
But why not of both, Peter? It's a bigger universe than just this side of the grave.
Because there isn't anything on the other side.
But that's just an assertion.
No, it's the lack of evidence.
Well, let's go to another question. This is a very interesting one. I'm a scientist and long-standing atheist. Taking the challenge as a scientist to follow the evidence where it leads over many years, I have become convinced that there is good evidence to point towards an all-powerful, transcendent, timeless creator. But I cannot square this with how I feel. My instincts, my emotions say it cannot be. It's impossible. Do either of you think it's possible to resolve such a dissonance? How, from each perspective, would you proceed? Says they feel pulled in both directions.
This is absolutely intriguing to me. Why? This morning I had a letter from a very highly educated a person with a doctorate doing very advanced research who asked me exactly the same question. Exactly the same question. Come from atheism, Dawkins type atheism, and now feels terribly pulled and wondering, this feels so strange, how can I resolve it? My attitude to that is take time. Talk to other people, other Christians, your friends. Find out what makes them tick. And read as much as you can, full of questions, something like the Gospel of John and so on and so forth. And I believe eventually one can resolve these questions. But it's clear that many people feel like this. And I think it's wonderful if you get that far. And in one sense, they can be resolved. But with many of these things, what the problem we have, especially in our contemporary culture, is the matter of commitment. You see, skepticism is a wonderful thing. The Greek word means to check out from a distance. And some of you will be checking out partners at a distance. But you know as well as I do, in order to have a meaningful relationship, you have to give up your distance. If you want to get to know me, sooner or later, you'll have to give up your distance and I'll have to give up my distance. But if we're sensible, we'll not do it without evidence. And so it's a question of that greatest commitment of all, as I believe it is, which is to Christ. Making that step of commitment is for some people difficult, but it's in the end the only way to test if the thing works.
Do you have any advice for this long-standing atheist who says he's feeling suddenly torn?
Yes, it's like John's, but has a slightly different thrust.
I thought it might.
It is to hang on to his commitment, but it's to hang on to his commitment to rationality.
Oh, I would want him to hang on to his commitment to rationality, of course, too.
You can't be rational and a Christian.
Right. Any response,
Peter,
John? The gloves are off.
Yes, Peter, yes, I have a response. What do you say to a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who's a Christian?
Grow up.
Well, between 1900 and 2000, 65% of Nobel Prize winners were Christian.
Yeah.
Can you understand, Peter, how saying that might come across as incredibly arrogant?
No.
No. Let's go to another question. Maybe you'll start this one off, John. Why would God create atheists?
I feel quite strongly about this, that the wonderful thing about the way in which we're made as human beings is God loves us enough to give us real responsibility so that our decisions and our moral choices are full of meaning. If you say God creates Christians or atheists, you end up with a kind of robotic situation where we're simply puppets on a string. And I don't think that accords in any way with the God who reveals himself in Christ.
Peter?
I think it's talk of gods creates atheists.
Talking about God creates atheists? As in once people start to look into it, they become atheists?
Yeah, well, so they should.
Right.
And when they see the evil that belief in God brings into the world.
Well, that opens up another interesting question. Here's one who asks, do you agree that science gives facts and religion gives values? What do you say to that, Peter?
Well, I don't know what values are, frankly. They are, I think we're talking about moral values.
I assume that's what...
Of whether science can illuminate morality and questions of moral behavior and so on. And I think it can, because we behave in ways that are governed by the infrastructure that has emerged through evolution. I mean, it's really, we who've been on this earth for, say, 4 billion years or so, have evolved into us, and we found ways of behaving, and we call that our current moral precepts.
Right. But would you grant the question of the fact that religion could be a factor that helps people to develop those moral values, even if you think it's ultimately got a scientific explanation?
It might be thinking backwards. I imagine that I suspect that quite a lot of what Jesus said, or his purports to have been said, were reverse engineered to make him sound like a jolly nice chap. And he probably was quite a jolly nice chap, if in fact he ever existed. So I think the Bible is a kind of collection of, it's a handbook on getting through life more.
The same question, I suppose, then, John. This morality, firstly, I suppose, responding to Peter, can it simply be accounted for by a sort of evolutionary cooperation produces?
I don't think so. I think you can base virtually any kind of morality on theories of evolution. If you take the nature red and tooth and claw view and survival of the fittest, you'll end up in Auschwitz.
But I did go beyond that. I said it was larded with the milk of humankind.
Yes, well, I was just about to say Darwin favoured ants, and if you watch ants, you can get a good argument for altruism and cooperation. You can build any kind of morality on animal behaviour you want. My view is that you cannot get morality from science. Science can comment on it. Science can tell you whether a fetus suffers pain, for example, but it cannot decide the morality of what you do with that fetus.
No, but it can understand. It can understand. And I'm not saying that it can make predictions or anything like that, but I think it can understand the roots of morality.
Well, I'm not sure that it can.
I think it's much better to understand the roots of morality through scientific investigation, which includes anthropology, ethology, and so on, than it is simply to adhere to a collection of folk stories as written in various.
Well, all of this is wild speculation. But if I come back to the question of morality and science, Einstein made the point once: you can speak of the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot speak of the scientific foundations of ethics.
Well, I think
Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, points out that the laws of nature don't come along with rules on what we ought to do with them.
But evolution does, and ethology does, psychology does, philosophy does. And all these are...
But saying evolution does is no different from saying God does. It's just putting a label on a non-explanation. But let me come to this, Peter. You slipped in one or two things which troubled me. And one of them was, if Jesus ever existed. Now, you're interested in science and evidence. I do not know, and I've read most of them, an ancient historian in the world who would question not only the existence of Jesus, but the basic facts of his life and so on. People who study these things, and it worries me when a person like you says, if he ever existed.
Well, you should
because the evidence is there that he did exist.
You should read more widely than you clearly have done. I mean, there's plenty of scholars who've questioned the historical existence.
And if I might say so, Richard Dawkins quoted one of them. Dawkins does believe that Jesus exists, but he says a good case can be made out that Jesus never existed. And he mentions Professor Wells of London. He didn't tell anybody that this is a professor of German, not an ancient historian. So I'm afraid I have read both atheist ancient historians, Christians, agnostics, all the rest. They are agreed basically on this. So it seems to me that if you're interested on making observations and notes and science in that general sense, then Jesus' existence is scientifically established. It's rationally established by historical science.
I don't know what percentage I put on that. Maybe 80% true. But I don't think 100%.
Let's talk about a question that relates to this. Someone asked, why does John specifically believe in the Christian God? What about other religions? And another person asked a similar question, how is one to decide between the thousands of faith on offer without the use of a reliable method such as science? So why your God and not another one, John? And how do you come to that conclusion in the first place?
This is quite a sensitive question, but the only way I can approach it is by Peter's method of rational inquiry. And you see, at one level, let's take the three monotheistic religions. But before I say anything, this is important. You've heard me clearly say that I believe you, whatever you believe, are made in the image of God and therefore of infinite value. Secondly, you've heard me say that I believe that there's a common element in morality. So when you raise with me the questions of other religions, please understand, I'm not criticizing your morality. That is very important. Nor am I criticizing your value. I'm being asked a rational question. On what basis do you choose? So I'll tell you. Here is one level. the three great monotheistic religions, their attitude to the resurrection, forgive me, Peter, if I raise it again, is, forgive the pun, it wasn't intended. My Jewish friends believe that Jesus died and did not rise. My Muslim friends believe he didn't die. I believe he both died and rose. Those three things cannot be simultaneously historically correct. So we have to do investigations in exactly the same way as we investigate any event in history. We can't repeat it to see what happened, but we can make an inference to the best explanation. And all I can say in the short answer is, I've done that investigation many times and come to the conclusion that the Christian explanation is true. But there's a second explanation, and it's this. I often ask myself, traveling around the world as I've done, ask people of different religions what they mean by a religion. And they usually come up with something like Southampton University, in the following sense. You have an entrance exam into the university and you get in. And then you're on the way or the path, and you're being taught by delightful professors. And then you face the final judgment, which is called finals. Do you recognize that? Okay. Now, on the way, on your path, the professors, however kind they are, cannot guarantee that you're going to get through at the end. Why? Because the basic principle of a university course is merit. Now, many of my friends, when I ask them about religion, including Christianity, they say that's it. There's a ceremony at the beginning, perhaps performed at a child or an adult. Then you're on the way, or the Eightfold Path, or whatever it is, the Tao, the teaching. And then you're faced with a final assessment. But the teachers, the gurus, and all the rest of them, the priests, cannot guarantee your acceptance at that final judgment.
I think I can provide...
I thought
you finished.
No, I think John hasn't quite hit the punchline yet.
I haven't hit the punchline. Christianity, if that's what religion is, Christianity is not a religion, for a very simple reason. In Christianity, the acceptance comes at the beginning, not the end. Now, I mentioned that briefly on the way through tonight, and this is the spectacular difference, that as I sit here, I've not reached the final judgment, but I know that I'm accepted. Why? Because I'm very good? No. Because of what Christ has done. And the absolute essence of what it is to be a Christian is that I have trusted him, that what he did on the cross, now this may seem all mystique to you, but let me say what it is, that what he did there means that I can be accepted at the beginning of the journey. That makes a spectacular difference. In fact, you wouldn't if it was a question of marriage. Imagine I propose to a girl and say, look, here's a cookbook. There are rules in it. You keep them pretty well for the next 40 years and then I'll accept you. Well, she'd throw the book in my face. But that's what many of us think of God. No wonder people give up on religion, in my view.
You finished.
Because it becomes a slavish trying to merit acceptance, when Christ is prepared to give his salvation as a free gift. So I'm not doing this evening, for example, to gain brownie points with God. I'm doing it because God has accepted me, and that is the wonder of Christianity to me.
Well, if I can help John with a more succinct answer to why he is a Christian, it's simply that he was brought up in Ireland.
But Peter, that's absurd. That's saying that because you give a genetic origin for me, that explains everything I do.
No, it's a cultural condition.
No, but the point is, Peter...
And I've met many Northern Irish atheists as well.
There are, very many.
There are always exceptions.
But Peter, I have experienced again and again people changing their worldview, which shows it's not culturally dependent. That was one of the most important questions for me in life.
It shows that you are particularly contaminated by your upbringing.
Well, it's very nice of you to say so.
It's been an interesting evening. We are sort of needing to draw things to a close. Are there any final things we'd like to say that we want to sort of round off the evening with before we go our separate ways? Do you want to start, Peter?
Well, science is the way, the truth, and the light. we should be proud, as I said right at the beginning, that somehow or other, through collaborative enterprise and open-mindedness and mathematization and observation, we are delving into the workings of the world, into, if you like, the fabric of reality, and answering all the great questions of being. We should be proud that we apes who have dropped from the trees have gone so far intellectually. And although I acknowledge that religious belief was a component of that journey, we are breaking out of that chrysalis and taking over the heath.
John, final thoughts.
Science is wonderful. But the God who gives us a world in which science can be done is even more wonderful. And I'm very
In the dialogue above, the speakers address falsifiability, moral foundations, religious plurality, and final worldview commitments, and I find the declaration that a position is immune to evidence to be philosophically self-defeating. This final section brings the debate to its most revealing moment, not through new arguments, but through an explicit disclosure of intellectual posture. When one participant openly states that there is no possible evidence that could ever change his mind, the conversation crosses a crucial threshold. At that point, the issue is no longer disagreement over conclusions, but disagreement over what it means to reason at all. Falsifiability is often invoked as a hallmark of rationality, particularly within scientific discourse. A claim is considered meaningful, it is said, only if it can, in principle, be shown false. Yet here we encounter a striking inversion. The atheist position, which prides itself on allegiance to evidence, declares itself unfalsifiable. Even if the central claim of Christianity were witnessed directly, so the argument goes, it would be dismissed as hallucination. This is not skepticism, it is insulation. John Lennox's response is carefully calibrated. He does not claim that his own position is beyond question. On the contrary, he outlines concrete conditions under which he would reconsider his beliefs, demonstrable inauthenticity of the gospel records, a compelling alternative explanation for the resurrection, or decisive evidence that his lived experiences of faith are systematically illusory. This distinction is critical. One worldview admits the possibility of revision, the other explicitly denies it. Rational inquiry depends not on certainty, but on openness. A position that cannot be corrected by evidence is not strong, it is brittle. It may appear confident, but it achieves that confidence only by removing itself from the very standards it claims to uphold. In this sense, the charge of faith applies inescapably. The question is not whether one has faith, but where one places it. The appeal to psychology as a universal solvent further illustrates this asymmetry. Religious experience is dismissed as psychological projection, yet the psychological motivations of disbelief are treated as irrelevant. Lennox rightly notes that explanatory tools must cut both ways. If belief is to be explained away as wish fulfillment or cultural conditioning, then disbelief must be subjected to the same analysis. Otherwise, psychology becomes a rhetorical weapon rather than an explanatory framework. The discussion then turns to morality, where the limitations of reductionist accounts become evident. Evolutionary explanations can describe how moral behaviors may have emerged, but they cannot tell us why certain actions ought to be considered right or wrong. Description does not yield prescription. Science can inform moral reasoning, but it cannot generate moral obligation. This is not a theological assertion. It is a widely recognized philosophical distinction. When moral values are reduced entirely to survival strategies, their normative force evaporates. If morality is nothing more than an evolutionary byproduct, then concepts like justice, human dignity, and moral responsibility lose their binding authority. Lennox's point is not that science is irrelevant to ethics, but that ethics cannot be grounded in science alone without smuggling in values from elsewhere. The conversation then widens to the question of religious plurality. Lennox's approach here is notably restrained and principled. He affirms the moral worth of individuals across traditions, while insisting that contradictory truth claims cannot all be simultaneously correct. This is not intolerance, it is logical consistency. To refuse to evaluate competing claims is not humility, but abdication of reason. The resurrection once again emerges as a historical hinge. Different traditions make mutually exclusive claims about the same event. These claims must therefore be investigated using the same historical reasoning applied to any other event in antiquity. To exempt religious claims from evaluation is not respect, it is condescension. At this stage, the debate has moved beyond isolated arguments and into the terrain of worldview coherence. The question is no longer whether a particular belief is comforting or culturally inherited, but whether a worldview can account for reason, morality, experience, and truth without contradiction. Lennox's position is not that Christianity is easy, but that it is intellectually livable. As the discussion moves toward its conclusion, the asymmetry in explanatory standards becomes increasingly apparent. Cultural conditioning is offered as a sufficient explanation for religious belief, yet it is never applied with equal seriousness to unbelief. If growing up in a religious environment explains belief, then growing up in a secular or scientific environment must equally explain disbelief. To apply sociological reduction selectively is not analysis, it is special pleading. Lennox's point here is subtle but decisive. Explanations that claim to account for everything end up accounting for nothing. If every belief is fully explained by upbringing, then rational evaluation itself becomes illusory. Arguments lose their force, evidence loses its authority, and persuasion becomes impossible. Yet the debate itself presupposes that reasons matter, and that conclusions are not merely the byproducts of conditioning. One cannot consistently argue against rational belief while relying on rational argument to do so. The moral discussion reinforces this tension. Appeals to evolutionary origins may illuminate how certain behaviors developed, but they cannot justify why moral obligations bind us even when they conflict with self-interest. The language of ought cannot be derived from the language of is. This is not a religious claim imposed upon science. It is a philosophical boundary long recognized within ethical theory. Lennox's invocation of scientists who acknowledge this limit underscores an important point. Recognizing the boundaries of science does not diminish science, it protects it. When science is pressed into service as the foundation of ethics, it is forced to perform a task it was never designed to accomplish. The result is not moral clarity, but moral ambiguity dressed in scientific language. The question of competing religions brings the discussion to a final point of intellectual honesty. Lennox does not claim that Christianity is true simply because it is meaningful or comforting. He grounds his commitment in specific historical claims, particularly the resurrection. These claims, he insists, are open to investigation, criticism, and rejection. They are not insulated by definition. This willingness to submit belief to scrutiny stands in stark contrast to the earlier declaration that no evidence could ever count against atheism. The analogy contrasting merit-based religious systems with Christianity's emphasis on grace is not offered as emotional appeal, but as conceptual clarification. Whether one accepts it or not, it presents a coherent internal logic that addresses the problem of moral failure without reducing religion to self-improvement. The charge that such belief is merely inherited fails to account for the countless cases of conversion, deconversion, and worldview change that occur across cultures and generations. As the debate closes, the final statements reveal the deepest divergence. One side elevates science into a comprehensive worldview, assigning it metaphysical authority it cannot justify on its own terms. The other affirms science as a powerful and indispensable tool, while refusing to confuse method with meaning or mechanism with ultimate reality. The disagreement is not between intelligence and superstition, but between two different understandings of what intelligence requires. What ultimately stands exposed is the question of openness. A worldview that declares itself immune to correction forfeits its claim to rational superiority. A worldview that remains open to evidence, argument, and self-critique, even at personal cost, demonstrates intellectual courage. Lennox's position, whether one agrees with it or not, operates within that second category. In the end, the debate is not resolved by applause or clever retorts. It is resolved, if at all, by each listener confronting the question that underlies every argument presented. whether reason itself is an accidental byproduct of a mindless universe or a trustworthy guide precisely because reality is grounded in mind. How one answers that question will determine not only one's conclusions about God, but one's understanding of truth, morality, and meaning itself.